The sprawling countryside stretched out in every direction, a patchwork of rolling hills, golden fields, and dense woods that seemed to hum with life. Jake leaned against the porch railing of their old farmhouse, watching Mia toss a tennis ball across the yard. 10 eager dogs, tails wagging and tongues lolling, bounded after it in a flurry of fur and energy. The leader of the pack, a shepherd mix named Toby, snatched the ball mid-air and dashed triumphantly back to Mia, his intelligent brown eyes glowing with pride. Mia laughed, crouching down to scratch behind Toby's ears. "You're too fast for them, Toby," she said, her voice warm with affection. Jake couldn't help but smile. Mia had a way of lighting up the world around her, and seeing her like this with their dogs bounding happily around her, the sunlight catching in her dark hair filled him with a deep, quiet contentment. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel path, and joined her in the yard. "You're spoiling him," Jake teased, nodding toward Toby as the dog pressed closer to Mia, basking in her attention. "He deserves it," Mia replied, grinning up at him. "Doesn't he, boy?" Toby barked once in agreement, his tail wagging furiously. Jake reached out to ruffle the dog's thick coat, feeling the familiar warmth of his fur. Toby had been with them for 5 years, adopted from a rescue shelter after Jake and Mia had fallen in love with his gentle nature and keen intelligence. But lately Jake had noticed something unusual about Toby, something he couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just that Toby seemed to understand Mia better than any other dog Jake had ever seen. It was the way he moved around her, always attentive, always protective, as if he could sense her needs before she even voiced them. When Mia was sad or worried, Toby was the first to notice, pressing his head into her lap or nudging her hand until she smiled again. And when Jake and Mia argued, which wasn't often but happened now and then, Toby would position himself between them, his calm presence diffusing the tension before it could escalate. "He's more like a person than a dog," Jake said as they walked back toward the porch, the rest of the dogs trailing behind them. "Sometimes it's like he knows what you're thinking." Mia glanced at Jake, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe he does," she said softly, her hand resting on Toby's head. "Dogs are more intuitive than we give them credit for." Jake didn't respond, but the words lingered in his mind. That night, as they sat by the fireplace with the dogs sprawled around the room, he found himself watching Mia and Toby more closely. Mia was curled up on the couch with a book, one hand absently stroking Toby's fur as he lay beside her. Jake sat in his armchair, a mug of coffee warming his hands, and studied the way they moved together, Mia shifting to get more comfortable, Toby adjusting his position to stay close to her. It wasn't just affection. It was something deeper, something unspoken. Jake couldn't explain it, but he could feel it in the air, a quiet energy that seemed to hum between them. Later, when they were in bed and the house was silent, Jake turned to Mia, his voice low. "Do you ever feel like Toby's different? Like there's more to him than meets the eye?" Mia's eyes flickered open, and for a moment she didn't respond. Then she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" Jake hesitated, unsure how to put his thoughts into words. "It's just the way he acts around you. It's like he understands you in a way that's not normal for a dog, like he's connected to you." Mia's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, something Jake couldn't quite place. "I think Toby is special," she said carefully. "But isn't that why we love him? He's part of our family, Jake. Maybe that connection is just love." Jake wanted to accept that answer, but something about it felt incomplete. He nodded anyway, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're right," he said. "He is part of our family." But the questions lingered. And over the next few weeks, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Toby than they understood. The dreams didn't help. They started innocuously enough, images of Toby running through a forest, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, Mia's laughter echoing somewhere in the distance. But soon, the dreams grew stranger. Jake began to see flashes of places he didn't recognize, ancient villages, vast deserts, snow-covered mountains. In every dream, Toby was there, always by Mia's side, his presence a constant even as the surroundings changed. Jake would wake in the middle of the night, his heart racing, the dreams lingering in his mind like half-remembered memories. He didn't tell Mia about the dreams at first, unsure of how to explain them. But one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, he decided to take the chance. "I've been having these dreams," he said, his voice quiet, "about you and Toby. But they're not normal dreams. They feel real, like memories." Mia turned to him, her expression sharp with interest. "What kind of dreams?" Jake hesitated, then described them, every detail, every strange, vivid image. As he spoke, Mia's face grew pale, her hands tightening in her lap. "I've had those dreams too," she said when he finished, her voice trembling. For as long as I can remember. The admission sent a chill through Jake. What do you think they mean, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia looked down at Toby, who was lying at her feet, his head resting on his paws. I don't know, she said softly, but I think Toby does. Jake stared at her, his mind reeling. He had always thought of Toby as their beloved dog, a loyal and loving companion. But now he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to their story, if Toby was more than just a pet, if he was a link to something deeper, something that spanned not just years but lifetimes. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the sky, Jake felt a strange mix of fear and wonder. Whatever the truth was, he knew one thing for certain: their family, him, Mia, Toby, and the rest of the pack was connected in ways he was only beginning to understand. And whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it, as long as they faced it together. The first dream came to Jake in the middle of a quiet night. The farmhouse was still, the only sounds the faint creak of wooden beams and the occasional shuffle of paws as one of their dogs shifted in sleep. Beside him, Mia lay curled beneath the blanket, her breathing soft and even. Jake's own eyes fluttered shut, his thoughts melting into the darkness, when suddenly he was somewhere else entirely. He stood in a dense forest, the trees so tall their tops disappeared into the misty sky. The air smelled of earth and rain, and the ground beneath his boots was soft with moss. The forest was alive with sound birdsong, the rustle of leaves, the distant gurgle of a stream. But it was the figure ahead of him that caught his attention. Mia. She was dressed in clothes that didn't belong to this time, a long, flowing tunic cinched at the waist with a leather belt. Her hair fell in loose waves, and her hands were cupped around a flickering flame, the light illuminating her face. By her side was Toby, his coat sleek and his eyes glowing with an otherworldly intelligence. Mia, Jake called out, his voice hesitant. She turned to him, her expression both familiar and unfamiliar. There was recognition in her eyes, but also something deeper, something ancient. We don't have much time, she said, her voice urgent. They'll find us if we stay here. Who? Jake asked, stepping closer. But before he could reach her, the world around him dissolved, and he woke with a start, the room spinning as his mind struggled to make sense of what he'd seen. It wasn't the last dream. Over the next few weeks, they came to him again and again, each one more vivid than the last. In one, he was a blacksmith in a medieval village, his hands calloused and strong as he hammered glowing metal into shape. Mia was there too, tending to a line of villagers who had come to her for healing. Her touch was steady, her voice calm as she worked, and Toby was never far from her side, standing guard like a silent sentinel. In another dream, Jake found himself in a vast desert, the sun blazing overhead as he trudged across the dunes. Mia was ahead of him, her crimson robe whipping in the wind, her hands clutching a small, intricately carved box. She turned back to look at him, her eyes filled with determination. We have to keep going, she said, her voice carrying over the roar of the wind. It's the only way to keep it safe. What is it? Jake asked, his voice hoarse. Our bond, she said simply, and then the dream faded, leaving him gasping for breath in the middle of the night. The dreams consumed him, their intensity leaving him shaken and disoriented. Each one felt like a window into another time, another life, and the emotions they stirred were as powerful as they were bewildering. The love he felt for Mia in those dreams was the same as what he felt in the waking world, but there was an added weight to it, a sense of history, of something unspoken but deeply understood. Jake didn't know how to bring it up to Mia at first. He wasn't sure how to explain what he was experiencing without sounding insane. But one morning, as they sat on the porch sipping coffee, he decided to take the risk. I've been having these dreams, he said, his voice cautious. About you and Toby. Mia looked up from her mug, her expression sharp with interest. What kind of dreams? Jake hesitated, then described them: the forest, the village, the desert. He told her about the urgency in her voice, the way Toby always seemed to be guiding them, and the sense of connection that permeated every moment. As he spoke, Mia's face grew pale, her hands tightening around her mug. When he finished, she set it down and looked at him with wide, searching eyes. I've had those dreams too, she said quietly. For as long as I can remember. Jake stared at her, his mind reeling. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know if you'd believe me, she admitted, her voice trembling. They've always felt more like memories than dreams, but I couldn't explain them, not to myself, and definitely not to you. Jake reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. You should have told me, Mia. Whatever this is, we're in it together. Her eyes softened, and she nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I know. I didn't want to scare you. You didn't, he said, his voice steady. But I think we need to figure out what these dreams mean. They can't just be random. Mia agreed, and over the following nights they began to share their dreams with each other, piecing together the fragments of their past lives like a puzzle. They discovered patterns, moments where their lives had intersected, no matter the time or place. In one life they had been farmers, working side by side to build a home on the edge of a vast wilderness. In another, they had been revolutionaries, fighting for a cause that had ultimately torn them apart. In every dream, their love for each other burned as brightly as it did in the present, unbroken by the passage of time. But the dreams weren't just about love. They were also about loss. In one particularly vivid vision, Jake found himself standing in the ruins of a battlefield, his sword clutched in his bloodied hand. The air was thick with smoke, and the ground was littered with bodies. Mia lay a few feet away, her face pale, her eyes fluttering closed as she whispered his name. Toby was there too, his fur matted and his body trembling as he pressed against her side. "Stay with me," Jake begged, dropping to his knees. "Don't leave me." "I'll find you again," Mia said softly, her voice filled with both love and sorrow. "I always do." When Jake woke from that dream, he was shaking, his chest tight with emotion. He turned to Mia, who was already awake, her own eyes filled with tears. "I saw it too," she said, her voice breaking. "Every time we lose each other. But we always find each other again," Jake said, pulling her into his arms. "That has to mean something, doesn't it?" Mia nodded against his chest, her tears dampening his shirt. "It means we're meant to be together," she whispered, "no matter what." Toby, who had been lying at the foot of the bed, stood and padded over to them, pressing his head against Jake's knee. Jake looked down at him, his heart swelling with gratitude and love. "And you're always with us, aren't you, boy?" he said softly. "You've been there every time." Toby's tail thumped once, as if in agreement, and Jake felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. Whatever the dreams meant, whatever truth they were leading them toward, he knew they would face it together, him, Mia, and Toby, bound by a love that had endured countless lifetimes. And in that moment, he realized that their story was far from over. It was only just beginning. The morning was crisp, the kind of cool that hinted at the arrival of fall. Sunlight filtered through the canopy of leaves surrounding the farmhouse, casting dappled patterns on the ground as Jake stepped outside. Toby was already waiting by the porch, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on him as though he had been expecting this exact moment. Jake crouched down, scratching behind Toby's ears, his touch familiar and grounding. "Good boy," Jake murmured, his voice soft. Toby leaned into the touch, his tail thumping lightly against the porch. There was something about Toby that always made Jake feel steadier, like the dog could sense the chaos inside him and was determined to soothe it. And lately, with the strange dreams and the growing realization that Toby was more than just a dog, Jake needed that comfort more than ever. Behind him, the screen door creaked open, and Mia stepped out, her hair tousled and her eyes still heavy with sleep. She held a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, her lips curving into a soft smile as she saw Jake and Toby together. "He's your shadow," Mia said, leaning against the doorframe. "You know that, right?" Jake glanced over his shoulder at her, grinning. "Yours too. I think he's just greedy for attention." Mia laughed, the sound warm and light. "Maybe. Or maybe he's just watching out for us." Jake stood, brushing the dust from his jeans, and joined her on the porch. Together, they watched the rest of the dogs romp through the yard, their energy boundless as they chased each other through the tall grass. But even as the others played, Toby remained by their sides, his focus unwavering. It wasn't the first time Jake had noticed Toby's behavior. The shepherd mix had always been attentive, but over the years, it had become clear that his connection to Mia went beyond the usual bond between a dog and its owner. Toby seemed to anticipate her moods, reacting to her needs before she even voiced them. If she was upset, he would rest his head on her lap, his presence grounding her. If she was tired, he would follow her to bed, curling up at her feet as though standing guard. Jake had always thought it was sweet, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The dreams had changed everything. Seeing Toby in those visions, always by Mia's side, always watching over her, had left Jake questioning what role the dog truly played in their lives. It was as if Toby wasn't just part of their family in this life, but in every life they had shared. That afternoon, Jake decided to take the dogs for a hike through the woods. The trails behind the farmhouse stretched for miles, winding through dense forests and along babbling streams. It was one of his favorite places to clear his head, and he hoped the walk would help him make sense of his swirling thoughts. Mia joined him, Toby walking between them as the other dogs darted ahead, their tails wagging furiously as they explored. The sun was warm on Jake's back, and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot was soothing. For a while they walked in silence, the rhythm of their steps matching as they moved through the trees. "Toby's different, isn't he?" Mia said, suddenly breaking the quiet. Jake glanced at her, surprised. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "He is. I've been thinking about it a lot," she continued, her voice thoughtful. "About the way he's always there for us. For me. It's not just loyalty, Jake, it's like, he knows us." Jake nodded, his gaze dropping to Toby, who was trotting along beside Mia, his ears twitching as he listened to their conversation. "I felt it too," Jake admitted. "Especially since the dream started. It's like he's more than just a dog. Like he's part of something bigger." Mia stopped walking, turning to face him. Her eyes were bright, filled with a mixture of wonder and unease. "Do you think he remembers, Jake? All those lives we've seen? Do you think he's been with us every time?" Jake didn't have an answer. He reached for her hand, his fingers curling around hers as he looked down at Toby. The dog met his gaze, his brown eyes calm but piercing, as though he understood every word. "I don't know," Jake said finally. "But it feels that way, doesn't it? Like he's been watching over us, guiding us." Mia crouched down, cupping Toby's face in her hands. "You're more than we deserve, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Toby licked her cheek, his tail wagging gently, and Jake felt a lump rise in his throat. As they continued their hike, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Toby was leading them somewhere. The dog's movements were purposeful, his nose twitching as he navigated the trails with a confidence that suggested he knew exactly where they were going. The other dogs followed his lead, their usual antics subdued as though they, too, sensed something important was happening. Finally, they emerged into a clearing Jake had never seen before. The space was bathed in golden light, the sun filtering through the trees to illuminate a large stone at its center. The stone was smooth and weathered, its surface etched with symbols Jake didn't recognize. Toby walked straight to it, sitting down beside the stone and looking back at Jake and Mia expectantly. "What is this place?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake shook his head, stepping closer to the stone. The air around it felt charged, almost electric, and he could see faint markings that seemed to shimmer in the light. Toby stayed by the stone, his posture alert but calm, as if guarding something precious. "It feels," old Jake said, "like it's been here forever." Mia knelt beside Toby, running her fingers over the stone's surface. The symbols were intricate, their patterns looping and intertwining in a way that reminded her of the golden thread they had seen in their dreams. "Do you think this has something to do with the dreams?" she asked. Jake crouched beside her, his hand brushing against hers as he studied the markings. "Maybe. Or maybe Toby brought us here for a reason." Mia looked at Toby, her eyes filled with gratitude and wonder. "You've been protecting us all this time, haven't you?" she said softly. "Not just in this life, but in all of them." Toby pressed his head against her shoulder, his tail wagging gently, and Jake felt a surge of emotion he couldn't put into words. Whatever this place was, whatever the stone meant, it was clear that Toby had guided them here for a purpose. He wasn't just their dog. He was their guardian, their constant, the thread that connected them across lifetimes. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing, Jake and Mia sat beside the stone, their hands intertwined and Toby lying at their feet. The other dogs settled around them, their presence a quiet reassurance. For the first time in weeks, Jake felt a sense of peace wash over him. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever it all means, we'll face it together." Mia nodded, leaning against him as she rested her head on his shoulder. "With Toby watching over us," she said, her voice soft but resolute, "we can face anything." And as the last rays of sunlight bathed the clearing in golden light, Toby lifted his head, his gaze steady and unyielding. Jake didn't need to understand everything to know one thing for certain: Toby had been, and always would be, their protector. Their bond, forged across lifetimes, was unbreakable, and it was only the beginning of their journey. The autumn air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. Jake stood by the barn, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket, watching the dogs race each other through the yard. Toby led the pack as always, his movements graceful and purposeful. Jake couldn't help but smile, but there was an ache in his chest, a weight that had been growing heavier with every passing day. The dreams hadn't stopped, and now the visions felt sharper, closer, as if the boundary between past and present was thinning. Jake couldn't deny the truth of what he'd seen or the bond that connected Mia and Toby through lifetimes. But knowing and understanding were two very different things, and Jake felt himself caught in the space between them. He wanted to believe, to fully accept this mystical truth, but doubt lingered, whispering questions he couldn't ignore. Mia appeared from the farmhouse, her sweater pulled tight around her as she walked toward him. Her hair caught the light of the late afternoon sun, and for a moment, Jake's breath caught in his throat. She had always been beautiful, But lately there was something almost otherworldly about her, as though the echoes of their shared past were written in the lines of her face, in the way she moved. Lost in thought again, she asked, her voice soft but teasing as she joined him. Jake chuckled, though the sound lacked conviction. Something like that. Mia studied him, her green eyes searching. You've been quiet lately. Is it the dreams? Jake nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. It's just a lot to take in. I want to believe, Mia. I do. But it's hard to wrap my head around. She reached for his hand, her fingers lacing through his. I get it, she said gently. It's not exactly normal, but I know what I feel, Jake. I know Toby has been with us through everything. I know you have too. Jake looked at her, his chest tightening at the sincerity in her voice. How can you be so sure? Because it's the only thing that makes sense, she said simply. The dreams, the way we found each other, the way Toby is with us, it's all connected. I feel it in my bones. Before Jake could respond, a sharp bark cut through the air. They turned just in time to see Toby racing toward the edge of the yard, where the ground sloped steeply into a wooded ravine. One of the younger dogs, a rambunctious golden named Finn, had slipped too close to the edge, his paws scrambling for purchase as the loose soil gave way beneath him. Toby, Mia shouted, panic flashing across her face as the shepherd mix darted toward Finn. Jake was already moving, his boots pounding against the ground as he ran after them. Finn let out a frightened yelp as he slid further down the embankment, but Toby reached him just in time, grabbing the scruff of his neck and steadying him. For a moment, it seemed like everything would be fine. But then the earth beneath Toby shifted, crumbling under the weight of both dogs. In a flash, they were tumbling down the ravine, disappearing into the underbrush. Mia, stay here, Jake yelled over his shoulder as he plunged down the hill, the loose dirt and leaves sliding under his feet. His heart pounded as he crashed through the trees, his mind racing with fear. When he reached the bottom, he found Toby lying still among the leaves, Finn curled against him and trembling. Toby, Jake said, his voice breaking as he dropped to his knees. Finn scrambled to his feet, seemingly unharmed, but Toby didn't move. Jake's hands hovered over the dog, afraid to touch him, afraid of what he might find. Mia arrived moments later, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She fell to her knees beside Jake, her hands immediately going to Toby. He's breathing, she said, her voice trembling. But he's hurt. Jake swallowed hard, his throat tight. We have to get him back to the house. Between the two of them, they managed to lift Toby, carrying him carefully up the hill and back to the farmhouse. The other dogs followed, their usual energy subdued as though they understood the gravity of the situation. By the time they got Toby inside and settled on a blanket by the fireplace, Jake's hands were shaking. Mia knelt beside Toby, her hands moving gently over his body as she checked for injuries. Her calm determination reminded Jake of the visions he'd seen, of Mia as a healer in some distant past. But now, in the present, her confidence couldn't hide the tears welling in her eyes. He'll be okay, she said, though her voice wavered. He has to be. Jake sat down beside her, his hand resting on her back. Mia, I can't lose him, she said, cutting him off. Her tears spilled over, and she pressed her hands to her face. I can't lose him, Jake. Not now. Not after everything. You won't, Jake said, his voice firm. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cried. He's strong. He'll pull through. But as the night wore on and Toby remained unresponsive, doubt crept in. Jake sat beside him, his hand resting on the dog's thick fur, and thought about everything Toby had done for them, for Mia, for him, for their family. If Toby had truly been with them through lifetimes, if he was their guardian and their protector, how could they face losing him now? The hours stretched into the early morning, the fire burning low as Mia dozed fitfully on the couch. Jake stayed awake, his hand never leaving Toby's side. At some point he closed his eyes, just for a moment, and when he opened them, he was no longer in the farmhouse. He stood in a vast field beneath a sky full of stars. Toby was there, standing tall and uninjured, his coat gleaming in the starlight. Jake stared at him, his heart pounding. Toby, he said, his voice trembling. The dog tilted his head, his brown eyes filled with a wisdom Jake had never seen before. It was as if Toby could see straight into his soul, as if he was trying to tell Jake something important. Then Toby took a step forward, pressing his head against Jake's chest. In that moment, Jake felt a surge of emotion so powerful it brought him to his knees. Love, loyalty, trust had flooded through him, erasing every doubt he'd ever had. When Jake woke, the farmhouse was quiet. The fire had burned down to embers, and the first light of dawn was filtering through the windows. He looked down at Toby, his heart in his throat, and then he saw it. Toby's tail twitched, just slightly. and his eyes opened, meeting Jake's with a soft, tired gaze. "Mia," Jake called, his voice breaking. Mia rushed to his side, her hands flying to Toby as tears filled her eyes. "He's okay," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. "He's okay." Jake felt a sob rise in his chest, and he buried his face in Toby's fur. "You scared the hell out of me, buddy," he said, his voice muffled. "Don't ever do that again." Toby let out a low, rumbling sound, half a sigh, half a growl, and nudged Jake's hand with his nose. Jake laughed, the sound thick with emotion, and looked up at Mia. She was smiling through her tears, her hand resting gently on Toby's side. "I told you," she said softly. "He's always been with us." Jake nodded, his doubts finally silenced. He didn't need to understand everything to know the truth. Toby wasn't just a dog, he was their guardian, their constant, the thread that held their family together. And as long as they had each other, they could face anything. The farmhouse was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Jake stood at the kitchen sink, washing the last of the dinner dishes, his hands moving absently as his mind wandered. Outside, the dogs played in the yard, their happy barks punctuating the stillness inside. It was peaceful, but Jake couldn't shake the weight that had settled in his chest ever since Toby's fall. The shepherd mix had recovered well, his strength returning day by day, but the near loss had forced Jake to confront the depth of their connection and the mysteries surrounding it. Mia entered the kitchen, carrying an armful of folded laundry. Her hair was tied back, and a faint smile played on her lips, but Jake could see the same unease lingering in her eyes. She set the laundry on the table and leaned against the counter, watching him. "You've been quiet today," she said gently. Jake turned off the faucet, drying his hands on a towel before meeting her gaze. "Just thinking. About Toby." Jake nodded, his brow furrowing. "About everything, really. The dreams, the connection you have with him, the things I've seen. I can't stop wondering why it's happening. Why us? Why now?" Mia stepped closer, her hand resting on his arm. "Maybe it's time we stop trying to figure out why and just accept it," she said softly. "Maybe this is the universe's way of reminding us that some things don't have to be explained." Jake sighed, his shoulders slumping. "It's hard to just accept something so big, Mia. It feels like every time I start to wrap my head around it, there's another piece I don't understand." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Then let's figure it out together." Later that evening, after the dishes were put away and the dogs had settled into their favorite spots around the house, Mia led Jake to the porch. The night air was cool, and the sky was a canvas of stars, their light unbroken by city glare. Toby sat at Mia's feet, his ears perked and his gaze fixed on the horizon as though he, too, was waiting for something. Mia sat on the porch swing, patting the seat beside her. Jake joined her, his arm draping around her shoulders as the swing swayed gently. For a while they sat in silence, the rhythmic creak of the swing mingling with the distant sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. "You've always been my constant," Mia said suddenly, her voice quiet but steady. "Through everything, in every life I've seen, you're always there." Jake looked at her, his chest tightening at the raw emotion in her voice. "And you've always been mine," he said. "No matter where the dreams take me, it's always you. It's like we're tied together." Mia nodded, her hand resting on his chest, over his heart. "I felt that for as long as I can remember. Even before we met in this life, I think I was looking for you." Her words sent a shiver through him, and he took her hand in his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I think I was looking for you too," he admitted. "But what about Toby? Where does he fit into all of this?" Mia smiled, glancing down at the dog lying at her feet. "He's always been with us," she said. "Every dream I've had, every life I've seen you, me and Toby. He's our guardian, Jake. He's the thread that holds us together." Jake frowned, his mind racing. "But why? Why does he keep finding us? Why does he care so much?" Mia's smile softened, her eyes shimmering in the starlight. "Because love isn't just between two people," she said. "It's bigger than that. It's family, connection, loyalty. Toby is part of us, Jake. He always has been." Jake let her words sink in, his gaze dropping to Toby. The dog looked up at him, his brown eyes filled with a quiet understanding that sent a jolt through Jake's chest. It wasn't just loyalty or affection. It was love pure, unshakable, eternal. "Do you think he remembers?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia nodded. "I think he does. And I think he's been guiding us all along, helping us find our way back to each other." Jake leaned back, his arm tightening around Mia as he stared up at the stars. The idea was overwhelming, but it also felt right. The pieces of their lives, the fragments of their dreams, the inexplicable connection between them, it all pointed to a truth that transcended logic and reason. They were bound together, not just by love but by something deeper, something eternal. The next day, as Jake and Mia worked in the yard, Toby stayed close, his presence as steady as ever. The other dogs roamed the property, chasing each other and barking at squirrels, but Toby's focus never wavered. He followed Mia as she watered the garden, his tail wagging softly whenever she glanced at him. When Jake chopped wood by the barn, Toby lay nearby, his gaze tracking every movement. Jake couldn't help but watch him, his mind turning over everything Mia had said the night before. He thought about the dreams, the way Toby had always been there, standing guard or offering comfort. He thought about the times in this life when Toby had seemed to know what they needed before they did, guiding them with an unerring sense of purpose. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting golden light across the yard, Jake set down his axe and walked over to where Toby was lying. He crouched beside the dog, his hand resting on Toby's broad back. "You've always been watching out for us, haven't you?" Jake said softly. Toby turned his head, his eyes meeting Jake's with a look so knowing, so deeply connected, that it made Jake's throat tighten. "Thank you," Jake whispered. "For everything." That night, as they sat by the fire, Mia pulled out the old journal she'd been keeping since the dreams began. She flipped through the pages, her fingers tracing the sketches and notes she'd made over the years. Jake leaned closer, his arm around her as he studied the images, scenes from their past lives, moments that felt both distant and familiar. "There's one thing that's always the same," Mia said, her voice thoughtful. "No matter where or when we are, we always find each other. And Toby is always with us." Jake nodded, his gaze lingering on a sketch of the three of them standing together in a clearing surrounded by trees. "It's like he's protecting us," he said, "making sure we don't lose each other." Mia smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Exactly. He's more than a dog, Jake. He's part of us. He's family." As the fire crackled and the dogs settled into their usual spots around the room, Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in weeks. The questions that had haunted him didn't seem as important anymore. What mattered was the truth that had always been there, written in their hearts and woven through their lives. They were bound by love, Jake, Mia, Toby, and the rest of their family. It wasn't something that could be explained or measured. It simply was, eternal and unbreakable. And as Jake held Mia close, with Toby lying at their feet, he knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. The farmhouse was alive with warmth, the golden light of the setting sun streaming through the windows and painting the walls with soft hues of amber and pink. Jake stood in the doorway of the kitchen, leaning against the frame as he watched Mia move around the room. She was humming a tune, her hands deftly slicing vegetables for dinner, her hair falling loose over her shoulders. The dogs lounged in their usual spots, the rhythmic thump of tails and occasional contented sighs filling the air. Toby lay closest to Mia, his watchful eyes tracking her every move as if her well-being was his sole purpose in life. Jake couldn't help but smile. This scene, so ordinary yet so perfect, filled him with a quiet joy. It wasn't just the love he felt for Mia, though that was always present, strong and unyielding. It was the completeness of their life together. The way their family, including the 10 dogs, sprawled across the house felt like the culmination of something far greater than he could fully comprehend. "Caught you staring again," Mia teased, glancing over her shoulder at him. Her green eyes sparkled with mischief, and the corners of her lips quirked upward in a way that made Jake's heart skip a beat. "Can you blame me?" he replied, stepping into the kitchen. "You're pretty mesmerizing." Mia rolled her eyes, but her cheeks flushed pink, and she nudged him playfully with her elbow as he came to stand beside her. Toby gave a soft bark, his tail wagging as he looked up at them, his gaze filled with something that felt almost human approval, affection, perhaps even understanding. "You too, buddy," Jake said, reaching down to scratch behind Toby's ears. The dog leaned into his touch, his tail wagging harder. As the evening wore on, the house settled into its familiar rhythm. Dinner was a lively affair, with the dogs circling the table, hoping for scraps, and Mia laughing as Jake attempted to tell a story but was interrupted by Diesel barking at a moth that had flown too close to the light. Afterward, they gathered in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth as the dogs found their places around the room. Mia curled up beside Jake on the sofa, her legs tucked under her, and Toby lay at her feet, his head resting on her knee. "This feels like home," Mia said softly, her voice filled with contentment. Jake wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. "It is home," he said. "For us, for them, for all of us." Mia smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Do you think it's always been like this? In all the lives we've lived?" Jake thought about the dreams, the visions of other times and places. He thought about the moments where he and Mia had found each other against impossible odds, always connected, always drawn together. And he thought about Toby, their constant companion, always there, always guiding them. I think it has, he said finally. I think no matter where we've been, no matter what's happened, we've always had this. Us, our family. Mia nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. That's what I believe too. That we're not just bound by love, but by something bigger. Something timeless. Jake kissed the top of her head, his chest tightening with emotion. Then let's make this life count, he said. Let's honor every moment we have. The fire burned low as the hours passed, and one by one, the dogs began to settle into their favorite spots for the night. Scout curled up by the door, ever the protector, while Luna sprawled across the rug, her golden fur glowing in the firelight. Toby remained by Mia's side, his eyes half closed but alert, as though even in sleep he was keeping watch. Jake and Mia didn't go to bed right away. They stayed on the sofa, wrapped in the quiet stillness of the house, their hands entwined as they talked about the future. They spoke of dreams of planting a bigger garden, of taking the dogs on longer hikes, of growing old together in this farmhouse that had become their sanctuary. And through it all, the knowledge of their shared history, their connection across lifetimes, wove itself into every word. As the days turned into weeks, Jake and Mia began to notice subtle changes in the way they lived their lives. The knowledge of their eternal bond, of Toby's role as their guardian, brought a new depth to their love and their family. They approached each day with greater intention, savoring the small moments that made up their life together. Morning coffee on the porch became a ritual, a time to reflect and reconnect. Walks through the woods with the dogs felt like journeys into something sacred, a reminder of the natural world's enduring beauty. One evening, as the first snow of the season blanketed the yard in white, Jake and Mia stood at the window, watching the dogs play in the falling flakes. Toby was at the center of it all, leading the pack in a joyous chase that sent snow flying in every direction. Mia leaned against Jake, her hand resting on his chest. I think they know, she said softly. Who? Jake asked, his brow furrowing. The others, she said, gesturing toward the dogs. I think they sense the bond we all share. Not just in this life, but in all the ones before. Jake considered her words, his gaze lingering on the playful chaos outside. He thought about the way the dogs had always seemed to understand them, the way they had formed a family that felt so natural, so complete. He thought about the times Toby had led them to places that felt important, the times the other dogs had followed without hesitation, as if they trusted him implicitly. Maybe they're part of it too, Jake said, his voice quiet. Maybe it's not just you, me, and Toby. Maybe it's all of us. Mia turned to him, her eyes wide with wonder. A family beyond time, she whispered. Jake nodded, his throat tight. Yeah, a family beyond time. That night, as they sat by the fire, Jake felt a sense of peace unlike anything he'd ever known. He looked around the room, at Mia nestled beside him, at the dogs sprawled across the floor, at Toby lying close enough that Jake could feel the warmth of his fur. This was their life, the life they had built together, not just in this moment but in countless others, across lifetimes and worlds. And as Jake closed his eyes, he felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by the quiet certainty of their future. It didn't matter where they had been or what they had endured. What mattered was that they were here now, together, a family bound by love that would never fade, never break. In this life and every one to come, they were home.